Good afternoon. Bon après-midi. Bonjour. I'm going to speak in English, so if you need translation, grab your headsets. I am reporting on the panel 10, which was on the implementation of the voluntary guidelines. Can I just try and understand, does everybody here know what the voluntary guidelines are? Can you put up your hand if you don't know what the voluntary guidelines are? Okay, good. A few people we can explain to you afterwards, but I think the session was looking at to what extent the voluntary guidelines on good governance of land, fisheries and forests, which was adopted by the Committee for World Food Security in 2012 after 2 years of participatory debate and dialogue between civil society, governments, private sector and intergovernmental organizations, have made a difference to implementation on the ground. If I had to choose one message which came out of the panel before lunch, it would be this: that the voluntary guidelines have successfully created space and shifted norms in a growing number of countries towards more inclusive and participatory engagement in land governance and tenure reform. So overall, a positive message. Considering that being a primary success factor of the voluntary guidelines, I have to say from the outset that one of the first comments on the panel was that we had sitting up here 4 speakers who either were representing government or were representing FAO. And there were many experiences from civil society of using the voluntary guidelines that were not represented from the frontier. So this was noted as an omission in the way that the panel was organized. It was also noted that we had 3 experiences from Latin America, 1 from Africa, and none from Asia and none from Europe. And those are also regions where the voluntary guidelines have been used quite successfully. Fortunately, from the floor, we got some more discussion. So I'll summarize for you some of the case studies. I think it was an interesting panel because it was very much based in discussion around experiences in particular countries. The first country was Guatemala. As many of you know, a very unequal and a very conflictive land context. The government asked FAO for support in implementing the voluntary guidelines in guiding a new agrarian policy for Guatemala. A key element was the strong support of a multi-stakeholder platform with civil society organizations involved. So the guidelines were used to give that process momentum in Guatemala. We heard from Madagascar, from the government of Madagascar, how the land reform process in Madagascar, which started in 2005, was the government used the voluntary guidelines as a guideline to guide their 2015 amendment to the land laws. And again, a key factor in that was the wide participation of civil society, which is one of the tenets of the voluntary guidelines. We heard from the Mercosur region how REAF has used the voluntary guidelines as a benchmark to assess legislation and good practice on land policies in support of family farming and in support of gender justice across different Mercosur countries. We heard from Colombia how the voluntary guidelines have been used as a tool to open up space for social dialogue between diverse interests on land, especially those that have been excluded from such dialogue: indigenous peoples, landless peoples, displaced peoples, and Afro-descendants. And we heard how these opportunities, which have been opened up by the peace accords, have used the voluntary guidelines as a benchmark. We heard from Chile how in the Mapuche region, the voluntary guidelines were able to create a space for indigenous peoples and officials from the forestry department of the government to start constructively, for the first time, debate about territorial rights of indigenous peoples in that region. So those were some of the good stories. We also heard some not so good stories. We heard how in Mauritania, a government which says that it recognizes the voluntary guidelines, but in reality, the legal framework is not supportive of community land rights, and the government is very actively dispossessing local people of their land rights on a large scale. So recognition in word, but in practice, not. We heard from Cambodia, we heard from Central African Republic, and we heard from Sri Lanka from the floor. about in all those countries how the voluntary guidelines either is unknown by the government or is deliberately ignored because of the powerful social and political and economic interests of people against applying the voluntary guidelines and bringing about a more equitable land tenure reform. We had a positive story from Scotland about how the Parliament is implementing new land reform legislation to address historical land grabs, with specific reference in that legislation to economic, social, and cultural rights, including the voluntary guidelines. It was noted that that might be a first for Europe and one of the first for the world. So, to conclude, 7 key points to summarize what came out of those different case studies and the discussion around them. Firstly, awareness in many countries is low about the voluntary guidelines, even though they were developed by all the countries of the world that are part of the Committee for World Food Security. Yet, there is high potential. Secondly, the voluntary guidelines is a tool among other tools. There wasn't that much discussion about the Africa Land Policy Framework and Guidelines. In fact, there was no discussion about that. We know in one region that's a very important benchmark. There was no mention of the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples or the Convention on Biodiversity, Article 8J, other international conventions and instruments that serve the same purpose as the voluntary guidelines as being an international benchmark for good land governance. Thirdly, the voluntary guidelines belong to everyone. Their legitimacy derives because they're a product of inclusive debate and an inclusive process that lasted a long time in the Committee for World Food Security and had a high involvement of many different civil society stakeholders. Fourthly, the voluntary guidelines are useless if there's no political will in the countries where they could be implemented. And we heard examples, and I mentioned them, of countries where they are aware of the voluntary guidelines, but there is no political will at all to implement them. Fifthly, there was some discussion about the voluntary nature of the voluntary guidelines. And the fact that governments are under no commitment to apply them, and therefore there was debate about how to promote their use, particularly by civil society. Point number 6 was that the voluntary guidelines in all those case studies served to give momentum to a process. So there was a process in each country that started a long time before and will continue for a long time after this moment. But the voluntary guidelines were a reference point, at a particular part of that process to give momentum to a more inclusive and a more participatory debate about land rights and land governance. And finally, a key value of the voluntary guidelines has been in opening discussions between governments, social movements, researchers, civil society organizations on land governance. And a key aspect of getting them taken up will be the possibility to create alliances for social movements and others to put pressure on their own governments and on regional bodies for the application of the voluntary guidelines. Thank you.
Merci, merci. Bravo. Bien.